Okay, let's dive in. Today, we're opening up a book that completely shifted how many of us think about the natural world and our place in it, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring.
That's right, a landmark book.
And we're taking excerpts from this absolutely groundbreaking work and doing what we do here on the Deep Dive, extracting the most important nuggets, the core messages, really, to give you a shortcut to understanding its power and why it still matters so much today.
It's a book whose impact is hard to overstate, really is. And what's fascinating right from the start is the story of how the book even came to be.
Right.
It tells you a lot about the challenges Carson faced in her deep personal conviction.
Absolutely. Let's unpack this a bit. Carson was already a renowned writer, known for her beautiful prose about the sea, right? By the time she tackled Silent Spring.
Yeah, she was well established.
She had the freedom to choose her subject, and you might expect her to return to that joyful marine biology work she loved. But something else had captured her attention.
Right. She had worked for the government earlier in her career. And she and other scientists were becoming increasingly alarmed by the explosion in the use of synthetic chemicals, especially pesticides like DDT, right after the Second World War.
They saw the dangers early on.
They really did, pretty much immediately.
And she tried to raise the alarm. As far back as the late 1940s, she tried to get magazines interested in an article about this, but she couldn't.
No luck.
Even a decade later, when the widespread spraying was causing, well, obvious destruction, publishers were still hesitant. Why? Because they feared losing advertising revenue from chemical companies and related industries.
That's a powerful barrier, isn't it?
Right.
The sources highlight a striking example. A manufacturer of canned baby food worried that an article like this would cause unwarranted fear in mothers.
Wow. Think about that. The fear of impacting sales potentially overriding a warning about public health.
Exactly. So this pressure meant that writing a book was really the only viable path, as book publishers aren't typically reliant on that kind of advertising.
Makes sense.
So despite initially trying to find someone else to write it, Carson realized it had to be her, even facing what she called a whole catalog of illnesses.
Yeah, she wasn't well.
No. And she doubted if such a dreary subject would even be saleable, but she pressed on.
And her motivation was incredibly powerful, almost a calling. She wrote to a friend, and it's a quote that really sticks with you. "There would be no peace for me if I kept silent."
That sense of duty drove her. The research for this book wasn't like her earlier, more joyful work. It required what the sources describe as a sense of almost religious dedication and extraordinary courage. She knew she was taking on powerful forces.
And the pushback was intense. A major chemical company even launched a preemptive strike before the book was published, trying to discredit her and claiming she had misrepresented their product, which was false.
Trying to shut it down early.
But here's where it gets really interesting and frankly inspiring. Those very attacks backfired dramatically.
Oh, totally. They generated far more publicity for the book than her publisher could have ever hoped to afford.
Exactly. The controversy drew attention, and the message, once heard, resonated so deeply that it had immediate, tangible results. President Kennedy himself set up a special panel of his Science Advisory Committee specifically to study the problem of pesticides.
That's direct influence right there. Amazing.
Incredible. So with that remarkable backstory in mind, let's step into the world Carson describes in the opening pages of Silent Spring.
Yeah, the opening is famous for a reason.
She famously begins by painting a picture of a seemingly idyllic American town, but something is terribly wrong. She describes a strange stillness.
Eerie.
The usual sounds of spring are missing, the birds are gone, people are puzzled, bird feeders are deserted, and the few birds still around are described as moribund, trembling violently and unable to fly.
Just awful imagery.
It was, chillingly, a spring without voices.
And that silence extended beyond the birds. Carson gives examples of farms where hens were brooding, but no chicks hatched.
Oh, wow.
Farmers couldn't raise pigs because the litters were small and the young survived only a few days.
Imagine the apple trees blooming beautifully, but with no bees buzzing among the blossoms for pollination. What's the result? There would be no fruit.
Exactly. And the roadsides, once bursting with wildflowers, were now lined with browned and withered vegetation as though swept by fire, silent and deserted by all living things.
It's devastating.
Even the streams became eerily lifeless. Anglers stopped visiting because all the fish had died. It's a powerful, almost haunting image of widespread ecological collapse, a springtime stripped of its fundamental vibrancy.
And Carson argues this wasn't just a series of isolated tragedies, it was a symptom of a larger systemic issue, what she describes as a chemical war against nature that can never truly be won. She saw the widespread spraying as creating an endless spiral.
That spiral is driven by evolution. Insects develop resistance to the chemicals we use. Carson calls this a triumphant vindication of Darwin's principle of the survival of the fittest.
Right. We spray, kill the weak ones, the strong, resistant ones survive and reproduce, so we need a stronger chemical.
And the cycle repeats over and over.
And it gets worse because you often see what she calls flare-back or resurgence. After spraying, the very insects you were targeting often come back in even larger numbers than before.
It's counterproductive. So her core argument isn't against all insect control. She acknowledges that control is needed. But her point is that the methods must be geared to realities, to the actual complexities of nature,
Right.
and not applied blindly in a way that could destroy us along with the insects. This problem, she points out, is deeply intertwined with our modern way of life.
To really grasp the problem, she takes us back to the insects themselves. They've been on Earth for vastly longer than humans, incredibly varied and adaptable.
And our conflict with them generally boils down to two main areas.
Yeah.
They compete with us for food, and they carry disease.
Simple enough, right?
Seems so.
Yeah.
But Carson makes a crucial point about how our own modern practices often make insect problems worse. Things like simplifying environments, creating monocultures, planting streets lined only with one type of tree, like elm trees. Exactly. In a diverse forest, a beetle that spreads elm disease might not find a host easily or spread very far. It's contained.
But when you plant rows and rows of identical trees,
You've essentially built a superhighway for that beetle and the disease it carries that just sweeps through.
another factor is the global spread of species. Humans have assisted a worldwide migration, as Charles Elton described it. When an invading species arrives somewhere new, free from the natural enemies that kept it in check at home.
It can become enormously abundant and suddenly a major pest. It just explodes.
And Carson points out that many of our most troublesome insect pests are introduced species operating outside their natural controls.
Which makes sense. The consequence of all this is that massive, broad-scale chemical campaigns become extremely expensive ways of buying time.
Just buying time, not solving it.
Right. Instead, she argues, we need basic knowledge of animal populations and their relations to their surroundings, understanding the ecology to promote an even balance and damp down explosive power of outbreaks.
This shifts the focus, right? From brute force chemical warfare to understanding and promoting nature's own resilience.
Precisely. Which brings us to the chemicals themselves. And here's where the sources contain a statement that's still shocking. For the first time, every human being is now subjected to contact with dangerous chemicals, from the moment of conception until death.
Wow, from conception until death.
Ah,
Think about that scope.
yeah. These synthetic pesticides are described as thoroughly distributed, found virtually everywhere in major rivers, in groundwater that can take years to flush out, and persistent in soil for long periods.
And they don't just stay put in the environment, they move. They lodge in the bodies of fish, birds, reptiles, animals so universally that scientists doing experiments actually struggle to find uncontaminated subjects.
Can you imagine trying to find a clean control group? Impossible.
You find them in fish from remote lakes and earthworms, in bird eggs far from where spraying happened, and perhaps most unsettlingly, in man himself, stored in the fatty tissues of the vast majority of people.
Found in mother's milk, and likely present in the tissues of the unborn child.
So where did these things come from? The source material explains their origin. They were a child of the Second World War, initially developed and tested on insects as agents of death, but intended for potential use against humans.
War research, essentially. Unlike older, simpler pre-war chemicals derived from minerals like arsenic or plants like nicotine, these synthetics are products of complex, ingenious laboratory manipulation of carbon molecules.
The source uses a simple analogy. Take methane, a simple gas, just one carbon atom with 4 hydrogens. Start substituting those hydrogens with chlorine atoms.
You get increasingly potent substances like chloroform or carbon tetrachloride. Carson notes that these seemingly slight changes in structure can yield poisons of truly extraordinary power. Little tweaks, huge effects.
Let's look at a few specific examples from the book, starting with one of the older ones, arsenic, which is still used in some weed and insect killers.
Yeah, arsenic's been around. Highly toxic and, perhaps most disturbingly, tasteless, making it a favorite agent of homicide, historically.
Right. It occurs naturally in some places, but is also linked to occupational cancers, like in English chimney sweeps. There are documented epidemics of chronic arsenic poisoning.
And it harms animals too. Horses, cows, bees, deer, fish. The sources note how the beekeeping industry was devastated in areas where arsenic was used heavily on cotton fields.
Devastated. Carson quotes Dr. W.C. Huper of the National Cancer Institute, calling the use of arsenicals an utter disregard of the general health and almost supreme carelessness. Strong words.
Very strong. Then we have the chlorinated hydrocarbons, names like DDT, chlordane, heptachlor, aldrin, dieldrin, endrin, the big players.
Yeah, the infamous ones. These are built on the incredible ability of carbon atoms to form complex chains and rings, which is fundamental to all life, but also forms the backbone of these potent poisons.
And they can enter the body through the skin, especially if dissolved in oil, through the lungs by breathing dust or spray, or by swallowing them, all routes.
Once inside, their structure means they are readily stored in fatty tissues throughout the body and the adrenals, testes, thyroid, liver, kidneys. They just settle in.
And this leads to a concept that's absolutely crucial to understanding the danger. Biological magnification.
Yes, explain that.
The fatty depots concentrate the chemicals. What this means is a tiny amount taken in from the environment can result in a much, much higher concentration stored in the body.
So it builds up.
Hugely. The source gives the example of just 1 part per million in the diet leading to 10 to 15 parts per million stored in fat. That's a 10-fold to 15-fold increase, or even more.
Wow.
This magnification means that even a minute quantity can bring about vast changes at the cellular level. Experiments showed incredibly low levels could cause significant harm. 3 parts per million inhibited a heart muscle enzyme.
Just 3?
Just 3. And only 5 ppm caused liver cell disintegration. And as little as 2.5 ppm of dieldrin or chlordane did the same. Tiny amounts, big damage.
So when studies found that the average person was storing potentially harmful amounts, and that the minimum levels detected in people were above the levels where organ damage may begin in animals, that's a serious alarm bell.
Absolutely terrifying, really. Let's look at a few more from this group. Chlordine leaves persistent residues and builds up cumulatively. Just 2.5 parts per million in the diet led to 75 parts per million stored in fat in animal studies.
That's a huge jump.
Massive. Heptachlor is nasty because it has a high storage capacity, and even worse, it converts into a more toxic substance, heptachloroperoxide, both in the soil and inside living tissues.
So it gets worse after it's in the environment or the body.
Exactly. And aldrin is particularly deceptive. In living tissues and in the soil, it changes into dieldrin. So if a chemist tests only for aldrin, they might conclude the residues are gone.
When they're actually still there, just morphed into something else dangerous.
Precisely. Dieldrin, you need a different test. It's insidious.
The sources include some truly heart-wrenching accounts. There's a detailed case of endrin poisoning a 1-year-old child in Venezuela. The family had their house sprayed for cockroaches, and even though they took precautions, the child somehow became exposed.
It's tragic. The family dog died first after coming back into the house. Oh. Hours later, the baby began vomiting, went into convulsions, and lost consciousness.
Oh, terrible.
The doctors reported that after this exposure, the child was little more than a vegetable, unable to see or hear, suffering muscular spasms, apparently completely cut off from contact with his surroundings.
Unimaginable.
The prognosis was grim. It was considered extremely doubtful that any useful degree of recovery will occur. And this wasn't a result of carelessness. It was the inherent, unforgiving danger of the chemical itself.
Moving to another class of chemicals, the organic phosphorus compounds, names like parathion and malathion, which you still hear about.
Yes, the organophosphates. Their mechanism is different, but the danger is just as real.
How do they work?
They attack the nervous system. Normally, a chemical called acetylcholine transmits nerve impulses, and then an enzyme called cholinesterase immediately destroys it, like hitting the brake pedal.
Okay.
These chemicals destroy cholinesterase. So acetylcholine builds up, the nerve impulses fire uncontrollably, leading to tremors, spasms, convulsions, and ultimately death.
Wow. It's like the accelerator is stuck on.
Exactly. It's a mechanism similar to some incredibly potent natural poisons, like the alkaloid in poisonous mushrooms.
The danger to workers is extreme. Those in fields, orchards, vineyards. The sources mentioned states setting up special labs to help doctors diagnose and treat these poisonings because they are so severe.
Yes, an occupational hazard.
Yeah.
Even doctors handling victims needed gloves, and a laundress washing contaminated clothes could be affected, just handling the clothes.
And their persistence is also a problem. Residues have been found on orange peel 6 months after what was considered standard treatment.
6 months later. Still there.
Finally, the herbicides, or weed killers. These really took off because people wanted a quick and easy method for clearing land.
Sure, seems convenient. But there's a dangerous myth that they are only toxic to plants. Carson makes it clear they act on animal tissue too.
Really? How?
They are described as general poisons, metabolic stimulants, and in some cases even tumor inducers, so not just plant killers.
Okay, so these chemicals are potent, they persist, they build up in living things, and they can cause horrific harm at the organism and cellular level. What happens when they get into the wider environment, the ecosystems?
The book provides some incredibly powerful and often frustrating examples, starting with water. The Clear Lake, California story is classic. They had a gnat problem. Annoying, but not life-threatening.
Just gnats.
Right. They used a chlorinated hydrocarbon, even in very low concentrations.
But because of biological magnification?
Exactly. That chemical made explosive progress through the natural food chain. The solution to a relatively minor annoyance created a far more serious but conveniently less tangible one.
So they solved the gnat problem.
But potentially poisoned the whole lake ecosystem. Essentially, they solved a trivial problem for a few people at the expense of creating significant risk to everyone relying on that water and food supply.
And it gets stranger. The sources describe deliberately introducing poisons into reservoirs to improve fishing. Authorities would dump poison to kill off undesired fish species, then restock with hatchery fish.
It sounds nuts, doesn't it?
It does. The book describes this as having a strange Alice in Wonderland quality. The public whose water supply this is forced to drink contaminated water or pay for expensive and not always foolproof treatment.
Agricultural runoff is another major source of contamination. The example from Flint Creek, Alabama is vivid. Heavy rains after applying toxaphene to cotton fields led to a massive fish kill.
What did they see?
The fish had erratic movements and a strange, deep wine color of the gills. Even test goldfish in cages placed in the creek died within a day. Clear proof.
Farm ponds are also vulnerable to runoff or even direct spraying. Even low concentrations, like just over 1/10 of a pound per acre in the pond, are hazardous. And once in, the poison is incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to remove.
It just stays there. Coastal waters, especially estuaries and salt marshes, are double whammy zones. They receive contaminated discharge from rivers and are often sprayed directly from mosquito control.
So they get it from both ends.
Pretty much. The Indian River, Florida example from 1955 is horrific. Dieldrin application led to a catastrophic, substantially complete fish kill. Sharks were attracted to the dying fish, and no species was spared.
Just wiped out.
Wiped out. And the sources suggest that the unseen effects in coastal waters might be even more disastrous than the visible fish kills. The exact chemicals and their quantities are often unknown. Testing is difficult in dilute seawater.
How do they change? Do they interact?
Exactly. How chemicals change during transit is unclear, and interactions between chemicals and minerals are almost unexplored. And alarmingly, research funding for this critical area is described as pitifully small.
That really forces you to question priorities, doesn't it? Our fisheries are an incredibly important resource, now seriously threatened.
Absolutely. Why are we pouring vast sums into developing and deploying more toxic sprays instead of investing in constructive research on less dangerous methods?
The sources ask directly, when will the public become sufficiently aware to demand such action? It's a question still relevant today.
Very much so. Now let's turn to a realm often ignored, but fundamental. The soil.
Right, not just dirt.
No. It holds teeming populations, a complex web of interwoven lives. The most essential are microbes, billions of bacteria and fungi in a single teaspoonful. The soil is only vital and healthy if this living community flourishes.
So the question that was largely ignored by the chemical control approach was, what happens when poisons enter the soil?
Yeah. Can we kill pest larvae without also killing the beneficial insects and microbes that break down organic matter and keep the soil healthy? Can we use fungicides without killing the fungi that are vital for tree roots?
These questions weren't being asked.
No. The book points out that this critically important subject was largely neglected and almost completely ignored by control men. The assumption was that soil could and would sustain any amount of insult. The very nature of the world of the soil has been largely ignored.
And the consequences are real and impactful, even on our dinner tables. Food contamination is one.
Right. The source describes a baby food manufacturer who learned the hard way about persistent residues. Benzene hexchloride, used 2 years earlier on a field, caused a terrible, musty taste odor in sweet potatoes grown there.
2 years later.
Still potent. The manufacturer refused the crop and had to buy from elsewhere at a financial loss, all because of lingering soil poison.
Chemicals in the soil can also directly harm crops. Hop growers in Washington and Idaho used heptachlor, and their vines wilted and died. The new roots died too. 4 years later, the soil was still poisonous with no known way to fix it.
4 years, and no solution. The growers had to seek legal action.
Moving beyond the soil itself to the broader landscape, Carson shows how attempting to improve on nature's way often rips apart the delicate balance of ecosystems. The sagebrush example is a powerful illustration.
Can you describe that natural system?
Sure, it was a thriving, balanced community. Sagebrush providing food and shelter, pronghorn antelope, sage grouse, deer, and even livestock could forage there. A whole ecosystem.
But the desire, often driven by cattlemen wanting pure grassland, was to eliminate the sagebrush.
Just get rid of it. And by ripping out the sagebrush, they ripped apart that closely knit fabric of life. Animals dependent on the sage disappeared or suffered.
Even the cattle they wanted to benefit suffered in winter without the sage for food and shelter. It backfired.
And the destruction wasn't limited to the target plant. The sources cite Justice William O. Douglas describing an appalling example in Bridger National Forest, Wyoming. Spraying for sagebrush also killed the willows along streams,
Destroying critical habitat for moose and beaver, impacting lakes, trout, waterfowl, and the whole recreational area. With a cascade of effects.
Chemical weed killers were seen as a bright new toy, giving users a giddy sense of power. Terms like chemical plowing were used. While seemingly cheaper than mowing, Carson argues this ignores the true ecological and long-range costs.
The example of the main roadsides is memorable, once beautiful with wildflowers and shrubs, now brown desolation after chemical spraying, leading to a loss of natural beauty and harming the tourist economy. Just scorched earth.
But an alternative existed even then, selective spraying, pioneered by Dr. Frank Egler.
What was that about?
The idea wasn't to clean everything, but to target only the tall, woody plants that would eventually shade out smaller growth, while carefully preserving the shrubs, ferns, and wildflowers underneath.
So working with the natural succession.
Exactly. This approach works with nature, building on its own stability. Shrubs are naturally resistant to tree invasion, so a well-managed roadside of shrubs needs little respraying, perhaps only once in 20 years.
Much more sustainable.
It can be done by hand, avoiding broad, destructive blanket sprays. It preserves the environment, wildlife habitat, and beauty. Egler's point was that the best controls are other plants, nature's own defenses.
Makes ecological sense.
Yet in suburban areas, Carson observed astonishing amounts of poisons, mercury, arsenic, chlordane being applied annually to lawns as crabgrass killers. Users often followed directions that resulted in applying huge amounts per acre.
Like how much?
Like 60 pounds of technical chlordane or 175 pounds of metallic arsenic per acre, just dumped on lawns.
Whoa. The resulting toll on dead birds was described as distressing, and the human lethality of these cumulative exposures in lawns was unknown.
One interesting alternative mentioned in the sources relevant to landscape management is using plant-eating insects themselves. They are described as the most selective of all grazers and could potentially be harnessed for pest control.
Insect allies instead of enemies. Interesting. Shifting our focus specifically to the direct impact on wildlife, the sources dedicate a chapter to needless havoc, stating unequivocally that chemical insecticides were directly killing practically every form of wildlife.
There's a disturbing underlying attitude identified that incidental victims count as nothing. If animals or birds happened to be caught in the spray, they were simply considered acceptable collateral damage.
Just write them off. This led to a direct conflict. Conservationists and biologists reported severe and catastrophic losses, while control agencies and chemical manufacturers flatly and categorically denied or downplayed them.
Who do you believe? Carson is clear about where the credibility lies. Professional wildlife biologists, she argues, are best qualified to interpret wildlife loss.
Makes sense. They study wildlife.
Entomologists often aren't trained or psychologically disposed to look for these broader environmental side effects. And the control men and manufacturers, she states, steadfastly deny the facts, choosing to pass by on the other side and to see nothing.
Their denials, she suggests, are explained by short-sightedness or vested interest, but their statements should not be accepted as qualified testimony on wildlife impacts. They have skin in the game. Cats,
Surprisingly, are highlighted as being particularly sensitive, especially to dieldrin. Because they groom themselves so meticulously, they ingest the poisons present in dust or on surfaces.
Ah, the grooming.
Symptoms included severe diarrhea, vomiting, and convulsions, with high mortality reported. In one area, 90% of farm cats were lost. This pattern was seen globally, even linked to mosquito spraying campaigns aimed at malaria control. Even basic veterinarian advice offered limited help against such potent, pervasive poisons.
Other mammals suffered too. Ground squirrels were virtually annihilated in sprayed areas. Dead muskrats and rabbits were found, and the fox squirrel disappeared from one community.
Just gone. But perhaps the most widely observed and heartbreaking impact was on birds. Beyond direct kills, there was the delayed effect on reproduction.
Right. People noticed nests were built, eggs were laid, but few or no young birds hatched. This pointed to a lowered reproductive capacity caused by some environmental agent. Something was stopping the cycle.
Experiments confirmed this. Dr. James DeWitt's work showed that quail and pheasants, given diets contaminated with DDT and related chemicals, appeared healthy, and their eggs looked normal. But few eggs actually hatched, and many chicks died soon after.
So the damage was internal, subtle.
Yes, birds on year-round contaminated diets laid no eggs at all.
Dr. Rudd and Janelli at the University of California found similar results with dieldrin in pheasant diets, lowered egg production, and poor chick survival. The dieldrin was stored in the egg yolk, effectively poisoning the developing chick.
Poison from the start. Then there were the mass, direct kills. The Dutch elm disease spraying in East Lansing, Michigan became a vivid, repeated tragedy.
What happened there?
Spring robins would return, and within a week they would be found dying in agonized tremors. The sprayed area had become a lethal trap year after year.
Lethal trap.
Oh.
Awful.
This pattern was confirmed by studies elsewhere. Professor Joseph Hickey at the University of Wisconsin documented 86–88% robin mortality.
Almost wiped out.
The Cranbrook Institute in Michigan put out a call for dead birds suspected of poisoning, and the response was overwhelming, taxing their deep freeze capacity. Over 1,000 poisoned birds from 63 different species were reported from just one community. The robin was often the most visible victim.
63 species, not just robins. Across the Atlantic, British bird kills in 1960 and 1961 were described by observers as the place being like a battlefield.
Wow.
Innumerable corpses from small songbirds to game birds like partridges and pheasants were reported. Many of these kills were linked to chemically treated seeds used in agriculture. Widespread destruction occurred across vast areas of agricultural England.
Carson highlights the common dilemma people faced, framed as birds or elms, but she argues this is a false choice, too simple. The chemical spraying approach, she shows, is often killing birds and not effectively saving the elms in the long run. It creates an illusion of salvation through spraying, leading to heavy expenditures without producing lasting results, citing examples where, despite years of spraying, huge percentages of elms were still lost.
So he's lose, basically.
Pretty much. Moving from the visible, devastating impacts on wildlife and landscapes, Carson takes us even deeper to the unseen fundamental levels of life, the cell and heredity.
Right down to the basics. To understand the full scope of chemical damage, she argues, we need to look at the minute structures and molecules within living things.
This takes us inside the cell to the mitochondria. She describes them like tiny powerhouses responsible for generating energy in the form of ATP.
ATP. Think of ATP as the universal currency of energy for all life, like a rechargeable battery that powers everything our cells do.
Okay, and the connection.
Many of the chemicals she discusses, including chlorinated hydrocarbons, phenols, and some herbicides, interfere with this energy production process. They disrupt the oxidative cycle that creates ATP. They mess with the powerhouses.
This interference with energy production could explain some of the effects seen in wildlife, like diminished reproduction. If you disrupt the cell's power supply, you could deplete the ATP needed for healthy egg and sperm development.
And for the energy-intensive process of embryo development. Experiments showed low ATP levels could halt cell division and lead to death in frog and sea urchin eggs. No energy, no life.
The book also explores heredity and the process of cell division, mitosis. This is the essential process where cells divide and chromosomes and genes are duplicated and distributed with incredible accuracy to maintain the continuity and integrity of a species, ensuring like begets like.
Fundamental process. Anything that disturbs this process is a grave threat to life itself.
And the alarming discovery was that chemicals could act like radiation, functioning as mutagens, causing genetic damage.
Like radiation, that's serious.
Yes. Dr. H.J. Muller, a Nobel laureate, found that various chemicals, including some pesticides, can raise the mutation frequency as much as radiation.
Dr. Peter Alexander, a leading British authority on radiation effects, warned that these chemicals, which mimic radiation, radiomimetic chemicals, may well represent a greater danger than radiation itself because they are so widespread in the environment.
Everywhere, unlike localized radiation sources usually.
Right. A critical question becomes, do these chemicals actually reach the germ cells, the sperm and eggs, where genetic damage could be passed down to future generations?
That's the scary part.
While there has been little direct human study, finding large residues of DDT in the gonads and germ cells of birds and mammals provides strong evidence that chlorinated hydrocarbons do come into contact with genetic material.
It gets to the reproductive cells.
Seems so. Further research showing a chemical causing sterility in birds by halting the division of gonad cells reinforces this concern. The idea that our reproductive cells are somehow shielded from these chemicals, the source suggests, has a low basis in fact.
This connects to the relatively new field of chromosome abnormalities, which became accurately measurable only in the mid-1950s. Studies were beginning to link certain diseases and abnormalities to disturbed chromosome numbers.
Like Down syndrome.
Right, referred to as mongoloids in the sources, linked to an extra chromosome, or the different sex chromosome patterns in Klinefelter's and Turner syndromes.
This leads to a profound question Carson poses. Can we afford to ignore that the chemicals saturating our environment might be striking the chromosomes, potentially causing conditions like these?
Is this not too high a price to pay? She asks. It's a chilling question.
Building on these invisible impacts, Carson also delves into the frightening link between these chemicals and cancer.
Ah, the C word.
The historical connection between occupational chemical exposure and cancer had been known since the 19th century, involving substances like arsenic, coal tar, and pitch.
But the 20th century, with rapid industrialization, introduced countless new cancer-causing chemicals into everyone's environment, even of children as yet unborn.
And this coincided with what the sources call an alarming increase in malignant diseases. Correlation isn't causation, but
it makes you look closer. Pesticides are directly implicated. Arsenic, as we mentioned, has a historic association with cancer. Diseases linked to chronic arsenic poisoning with tumors were documented.
the concern was that the widespread, long-term use of arsenical insecticides could replicate these conditions. Animal studies near arsenic smelters showed cancerous lesions in deer and sinus cancers in sheep, alongside the high mortality in insects and fish kills.
Another example is the weed killer aminotriazole. Even at low levels, it caused thyroid cancer in test animals.
Yeah, the cranberry scare.
Right. Its misuse on cranberries led to a major FDA controversy and seizure when residues were found. The science showed carcinogenicity in rats, and no level without effect was found. The human level is unknown and could potentially be even lower.
For many of the widely used chlorinated hydrocarbons and herbicides, the sources note that insufficient time had elapsed when Silent Spring was written to fully reveal their carcinogenic effects.
It takes time for cancer to develop.
Exactly. Most chemically induced cancers develop slowly, often with a 15 to 30-year or longer lapse after exposure, as seen in occupational cases or with tragedies like the radium dial painters.
Yet, within the relatively short period of modern pesticide use, there had already been a steady, noticeable rise in leukemia rates globally.
Really?
Deaths from malignant diseases of the blood-forming tissues increased sharply in the U.S. between 1950 and 1960. The sources pointedly ask, to what new agents in our environment are people increasingly exposed?
Findings from the Mayo Clinic reported by Dr. Malcolm Hargraves were particularly compelling. He found that the vast majority of patients he saw with blood disorders and lymphoid diseases, leukemias, lymphomas, etc., had a significant history of exposure to various toxic chemicals, including sprays.
A significant history of exposure.
He stated from extensive clinical experience that the vast majority of patients suffering from the blood dyscrasias and lymphoid diseases have a significant history of exposure to the various hydrocarbons, which in turn includes most of the pesticides of today. He believed a careful medical history would almost invariably establish such a relationship.
So doctors were seeing it. Medical literature contained case after case supporting this link. Farmers exposed to spray fallout, a student who sprayed his room, a woman using a lindane vaporizer, a cotton field worker.
Tragic individual stories. There's the tragedy of two young Czech cousins who developed acute leukemia and died just months after unloading sacks of BHC insecticide.
Oh my God. Or the Swedish farmer who died from bone marrow wasting after dusting his land with DDT and BHC dust, a case disturbingly similar in its outcome to the Japanese fisherman exposed to radiation fallout.
The effects sound eerily similar. The sources also explore potential mechanisms linking pesticides to cancer. One theory discussed is Warburg's.
What's that?
It proposes that carcinogens, whether radiation or certain chemicals, damage the cell's ability to respire, to produce energy efficiently via oxidation. This damage is irreversible.
Okay, so back to the energy production.
Yes. Cells try to compensate by relying on a more primitive method, fermentation, for energy. This struggle for survival and compensation, in a Darwinian sense, can lead to the creation of cancer cells.
So the damaged cell adapts, but becomes cancerous.
That's the idea. Pesticides that interfere with oxidation and energy production fit this model. They may create sleeping cancer cells that flare into the open later in life after further insults.
Another potential mechanism is the mutation theory. An agent causes a mutation in a body cell. That cell escapes normal controls, multiplies unregulated, and becomes a cancer.
Right, the genetic damage idea again. Mutagenic chemicals, like those that damage chromosomes, are suspect here.
There's also a potential indirect role. Pesticides can damage the liver and reduce B vitamins, both of which are linked to cancer risk.
How does that work?
Liver damage can lead to increased levels of natural estrogens in the body. Vitamin B deficiency is also linked to certain cancers. Combine this with widespread exposure to synthetic estrogens in cosmetics, drugs, even some food, and you have what the sources describe as a situation of most serious concern. Multiple factors piling up.
A chilling, real-world warning sign came in 1961 with a widespread epidemic of liver cancer among rainbow trout in hatcheries across the U.S.
In fish.
Yeah. This epidemic was directly linked to contaminants in the water and served as an early warning signal for a potential human hazard. As one investigator put it, we are living in a sea of carcinogens.
Living in a sea of carcinogens, that's quite a phrase. Faced with this overwhelming information, it's easy to feel a sense of despair. People might ask, isn't it a hopeless situation? Or isn't it impossible to eliminate these chemicals? Wouldn't it be better to just focus on finding a cure for cancer?
It's a tempting thought. But Dr. Huper, the authority on environmental cancer, offers a historical perspective. He saw the cancer situation as similar to the fight against infectious diseases in the late 19th century. Progress came from both prevention and cure. The decisive battles against diseases like cholera or typhoid involved eliminating the disease organisms from the environment, like the famous London cholera outbreak, stopped by simply removing the handle from a contaminated water pump. Prevention worked.
Simple but effective.
He questions why we are so slow to apply this preventive approach to cancer. He suggests focusing on cure is more exciting, tangible, glamorous, while prevention, though more humane and much more effective, lacks that immediate drama.
Less glory in prevention.
Perhaps. There's no magic pill for cancer. It's not a single disease with a single cure. Breakthroughs are slow, incremental. He argues passionately that neglecting prevention while solely pursuing cures is a disservice to humanity.
We need both. Which brings us to the crucial alternative Carson highlights. Biological controls. She argues that the chemical control approach is inherently self-defeating because it systematically weakens nature's own defenses against pests.
You kill the good guys with the bad guys.
Exactly. Two fundamental facts, she points out, are consistently overlooked by the chemical approach. First, nature provides its own highly effective control system through what she calls the resistance of the environment.
Nature keeps things in check, usually.
Second, the greatest single factor preventing insects from simply taking over the world is their constant internecine warfare. They fight and kill each other. Chemicals blindly kill both friends and enemies.
Natural enemies, the predators and parasites like ladybugs, predatory wasps, and flies. Spiders are working constantly in every season to keep pests in check. They're nature's pest control service.
And this is why chemicals often cause pest outbreaks. A classic example is the spider mite. These mites exploded in population after insecticide spraying because their natural enemies were wiped out.
So spraying made the mite problem worse.
Yes. The mites, which are somewhat resistant, were irritated but not killed. They dispersed, found more space and food because their competitors were gone, and reproduced up to threefold more, thriving because of the insecticides used to kill other pests.
Wow. The Vidalia beetle, a remarkably successful imported natural enemy of the cottony cushion scale that saved California citrus.
A huge success story.
It was completely wiped out by chemicals in some areas, leading to scale outbreaks worse than they'd been in 50 years before the beetle was introduced, undoing the good work.
Some entomologists, seeing this pattern, recognized that believing salvation lies at the end of a spray nozzle was fundamentally wrong. The answers, they argued, would come from biologists who understood living systems, not just chemists or engineers focused on synthesizing poisons.
Need ecological thinking. And the good news, the sources make clear, is that there is a truly extraordinary variety of alternative to chemical spraying. These are biological solutions based on understanding of the living organisms and of the whole fabric of life. A new science of biotic controls was emerging.
So what were some of these alternatives?
One promising approach is sterilization, a concept developed by geneticists and physiologists. The screwworm fly, a devastating pest, was successfully eradicated from the U.S. Southeast by releasing vast numbers of laboratory-raised males that had been sterilized by radiation.
Sterilized males? How does that work?
They mate with wild females, but the eggs don't hatch. If you release enough sterile males, the population crashes. This method is particularly effective for pests in isolated populations.
Never.
Chemical sterilants offer an easier method than radiation for mass application. The USDA lab was testing them against houseflies, which had become virtually uncontrollable by insecticides. A test in the Florida Keys nearly wiped out a housefly population in just 5 weeks.
5 weeks? That's fast.
The idea is elegant. Combine the sterilant with a bait the insects love, they eat it, become sterile, and then breathe themselves out of existence. As Dr. Nippling noted, this method had the potential to outdo some of the best of known insecticides because it targets the population's ability to reproduce.
Attacks reproduction, not just individuals.
Exactly. Attractants, or lures, offer another biological method, mimicking nature's own signals like the incredibly powerful scent released by a female gypsy moth to attract males.
Using their own communication against them.
Right. The first successful synthetic lure mimicked the gypsy moth's scent. Combining an attractant with a small amount of poison proved highly effective. Methyl eugenol, mixed with poison, was used in the Bonin Islands to attract and kill male fruit flies, eliminating over 99% of the oriental and melon fruit fly populations.
And the advantages?
The poison is highly confined, posing less risk to wildlife, and residues dissipate quickly, much more targeted.
Microbial insecticides, using disease organisms specific to pests, are another powerful tool. Milky disease, caused by a bacterium, has been used successfully against the Japanese beetle since the 1930s.
Wow, since the 30s?
Yeah, it's highly specific, harmless to humans and other wildlife, and applied by simply distributing ground-up infected grubs.
Another bacterium, Bacillus thuringiensis, or bleedy, kills pests by producing protein crystals that are toxic when eaten. The larva eats it, becomes paralyzed quickly, and stops feeding.
Bleed is still widely used today, isn't it?
It is. It's manufactured commercially and has been tested worldwide, offering hope for controlling pests like the banana root borer without resorting to broad-spectrum chemicals like dieldrin that destroy natural controls.
And of course, there's conventional biological control, importing natural enemies from a pest's native land.
The classic approach. The U.S. started this in 1888 with the Vidalia beetle, which saves the California citrus industry from the cottony cushion scale. About 100 species of beneficial insects have been successfully established in the U.S., saving millions of dollars annually for relatively small investment.
Huge return on investment. European examples include cultivating colonies of the forest red ant in Germany and Italy for natural forest protection.
Ants as allies.
And Dr. Rupertshofen in Germany pioneered the use of spiders as natural predators, cultivating wheel net spiders whose webs catch flying insects and whose young protect tree shoots.
Using spiders, that's creative. The source concludes that biological control has shown brilliant successes, and its approach is based fundamentally on biological understanding and guiding natural processes, rather than attempting to simply blast nature into submission.
It stands in stark contrast, the book notes, to the current vogue for poisons, which has failed utterly to take into account these most fundamental considerations of ecology and interconnectedness.
Right. It's described as a crude weapon, hurled against the fabric of life, with practitioners showing no high-minded orientation, no humility before the vast forces with which they tamper. Arrogance, almost.
And that brings us to the end of this deep dive into Silent Spring. We've journeyed from the haunting image of a silent spring through the pervasive contamination by synthetic chemicals, exploring their devastating impacts on wildlife.
Their insidious effects on living cells, heredity, and the potential links to cancer.
We've seen how the chemical approach often proves counterproductive, destroying nature's own defenses. And we've looked at the promising, yet often underfunded, path of biological alternatives that work with nature.
The core tension highlighted by Carson and still relevant today, is that reliance on brute force chemical solutions that ignore complex ecological relationships and long-term consequences stands in opposition to the need for deeper understanding, humility, and collaborating with the intricate web of life.
It's the brute force versus understanding dilemma.
Exactly. And this leaves us with a powerful and perhaps provocative thought for you, the listener. Given what we've learned about these chemicals pervading our environment, building up in our bodies from conception, and potentially impacting everything from our cell energy to our genes and our risk of cancer.
And considering that effective, less harmful alternatives have long existed, what responsibility do we as individuals and as communities have to question the chemicals in our food, our homes, our water, and our surroundings?
Yeah. How do we demand and support approaches that prioritize the health of the intricate web of life, knowing that we are fundamentally part of it?
It's a big question.
It really is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another exploration.